Welcome to Passion Institute podcast. How do we solve the growing businesses and trainings in organisations? I specialise with organisations that have between 20 and 200 employees. And how do we find the budget to be able to train people in the right things, particularly with so many changes happening? So today's podcast is called Training That Sticks and Solving Some of the Top Challenges that Occur for Growing Businesses. Training is one of the hardest investments to get right. And some people throw lots of money at it, but it's really important to be able to look at some of the key challenges that business owners and entrepreneurs face and how do you go about navigating them and what you actually do. The first time is that there's always a trade-off. The amount of time and productivity that you need to do that. So taking people time off the tools, as the saying goes, and, particularly when you're that mid-sized company, that's a lot of time, even if it's only a day, but 2, 3. And the idea is that, well, what if we actually put them into that training and there's that fear of lost hours? The fact that we won't do that. There's definitely a trend happening in terms of more micro learning. So rather than people attending courses these days, particularly if you've already got some qualifications, that's another 3 or 4 year qualifications, there's definitely more of an emphasis on the micro learning, which are how do we get that micro learning in the 15 to 20 minute bite-sized sessions, even rather than the 4 days? How could we do lunch and learn sessions? I know that the number of webinars, for example, I'm now running have gone up significantly in the last 18 to 24 months because people are wanting those bite-sized learnings at their lunch times. So running webinars that are 30, 35 minutes and then having a 5 or 10 minute Q&A allows to do that. The other way is also the fact that how do we blend in on-job training? So how do we train with people perhaps that are more experienced in your business with people that are less experienced? So how could they shadow that? How could they do maybe rotating some of those roles around? And could there be more of the balanced and project, based learning so that people could go in and work on specific projects while still holding the other roles? And are there any ways that we as a business that you could manage that and look at, asking that question, how could we actually get people shadowing that role? And again, that does not have to be full time. That only might be 2 hours a week. I know in the early 2000s, there was a lot of learning around shadowing called a day in the life of. I remember at the time I was in a management role and we were trying to bring people with technical skills like engineers together with people that had technical sales skills, and for each of those people to understand what the other one did better. And so we would call them a day in the life of, where the engineering or the technical person there who was doing the manufacturing or the operations would go and spend a day in the life of a salesperson and vice versa, just to have better common understanding that we were all working towards the same goal. So how could we even take a concept like that? If it's not a day, could it be a few hours off in the day off, and seeing how we can link that into the on-job training in terms of what you do? And having some digital modules that are self-paced, we've seen that market grow significantly. How could we use that without causing a lot of disruption in terms of what it is that you do? The second part of training, and in terms of getting training that sticks, it's so important to look at the cost of the training, but also the uncertainty that hangs around about the return on investment or ROI on that particular training. That's a big one for people because you never quite know unless that's the training that you've been doing for a number of years and it has had proven results. So training budgets are getting harder, they're getting tighter, and ROI feels sometimes a little bit hard to measure. So what are the ways that mid-sized organisations can do that a little bit better? Well, maybe starting something, small. So if you currently don't have a lot of training in place, maybe looking at one of your strategic priorities and things that you want to do. So that might be a specific thing around sales, or I know that something that's rising at the moment is I've had a lot of businesses request for training around speaking skills. How can I learn how to present my ideas better? And that seems to be a very common rise, certainly for me, running a small business, working with medium-sized companies. And so maybe look at focusing on one specific area rather than spreading your budget very thin and saying, look, for the next 6 months or 12 months, we're going to focus on that one particular business priority, whatever that is. Look at your strategic plan, identifying what that is, whether it's sales or customers or customer skills or the way that we, handle complaints or presentation skills, whatever it might be. Pick on something and then do fewer or one and then go deeper with it. The other thing on ROI is that when you're investing in that training, we need some sort of metrics. And people go, well, this is the problem that I have with this particular person, or this is a gap in the way that they manage X. And so we're going to send them for training on X. But sometimes we don't. We need better, measures around that. And how do we do that? Well, for example, if you're sending them on sales training, could we have a look at the sales growth? If you are training people in terms of how to do onboarding of new people, then could we measure how much faster the onboarding has got? If we're looking at customer service, even though it's not a direct correlation, could we then have a look at how many more errors or customer complaints we're having? So even if they're not direct measures, starting to look at some metrics that already exist in your business and linking them into the training can be really important. For example, I was asked that question around presentation skills, and the idea was the presentation more impactful? And this particular organisation that wanted some of their managers trained in presentation skills, they wanted to be able to, they already had a survey that went out. That was literally a 3-question survey at the end of their presentation. So let's look at that result for that particular manager before the training and after the training. And then you could see that there was a significant improvement for some and a mild improvement for others. So you can use whatever it is, whether it's direct or indirect, to be able to work out how we could measure some of that. And the other thing around being able to look at that ROI is maybe also leveraging some peer-to-peer learning. So there is some training and knowledge that already exists within the team. And so how could we manage that ROI? How could we get some of the people that are mastering certain areas to also run some in-house training where we know that ROI is going to be a bit more direct because the person that's already mastering that particular area is within your culture, is within the work that they're doing, and they could also provide some of that. And that can be shared at a low cost or sometimes for free, and we can make that as part of their role as well. And the last area that I wanted to speak about is how do we get that relevance of that training, and how do we also make sure that people are retaining that particular part? This becomes challenging because, how do we just make sure that people don't forget and apply that training? So for example, in my business, one of the things that I now offer when I've done some training or even a keynote presentation, at the end of the 30 days after the date of that presentation, offer a free webinar as part of my services. And so in that webinar, we do a recap of that particular training or that presentation and then hold a Q&A. So it's about a 50-50% split. Let's say the session's 45 minutes, so just over 20 minutes of that would be a recap and about 20 minutes of Q&A. And that is a great way for people to remember that. It's also a great way to touch base with the organisation again. So if you're that organisation and you have a number of different providers, maybe asking them and getting them to quote on a follow-up webinar or a follow-up Q&A about 30, maybe 60 days or quarter later after that training has been held, and also bringing that up in terms of how you can do some of that internally as well. The other tip there is to look at what I call the 70-20-10 rule. Obviously there. So we want people to be practicing 70%. We want 20% of that to be coaching and then 10% of that to be formal. So we want our people who've had that particular training to be accountable, and we want them to be able to follow up some conversations with you, with some of the others there. And we want to recognize people that are doing some of that really well. So in closing, as you look at the idea that how do we get training that actually sticks in terms of what we do, we want to, look at a time, a cost and a relevance and a retention perspective. And we want to make sure that we can look at that with some simple tactics. So I would really love for you, as I close this particular podcast, to think about an area in your business that would, with some better training, you could unlock, the potential of some of the people in your business, whether it's small, but somewhere that's really practical. And how could you measure some of the ripple effect that occurs as a result of that too? Thank you for tuning in. If you would take a moment to review and rate the podcast, I would always appreciate it. And please let me know any topics that for you would be relevant and would help you in the growth of your businesses.